All right, just like that, I think we hit 6 o'clock and we like to start right on time. So that's what we're gonna do. Good evening, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to our fauna webinar tonight on equine insurance presented by Jade Stanbrook. This program is brought to you by the Fauna Health Committee. We'll be recording this webinar tonight, and we will have this recording posted up in our library on the Fauna website in a couple days. We have a large audience tonight, so we'd have everyone that is present in listening mode. We'll stop periodically so we can get your questions over to Jade when she's given us a little bit of information. You can submit your questions on the Q&A section of the Zoom chat here. So let me introduce Jade to you. Jade has been the driving force behind Foy Insurance Equine since 2015. She had 15 years equine and aviation experience prior to that. She had caught the horse riding bug very early in her life, and they have been a very big part of it. She has a degree in equine management, a love of horses, and she's currently in Massachusetts. We're very excited to have Jade here tonight to give us some more information on this very important topic that I know touches Frisian owners and all horse owners. So with that, Jade, I will turn it over to you, and I will let you know when we have our first group of questions coming in.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for introducing me. Equine insurance is definitely sort of an odd thing, and I fell into it. So just a little background on me. I've been in horses, I've had horses, been riding for my whole life. I didn't plan on getting into insurance. It sort of just happened. And actually, it happened at the right time as soon as I graduated college. And I had been doing aviation insurance before that. So I would much prefer to talk to horse people than plane people. I still don't know a whole lot about airplanes, but I know a whole lot about horses. So anyways, equine insurance, there's a lot of misinformation on the web. A lot of people go on, especially on things like Facebook, social media, and relay information that is not always reliable. And so we always tell people, like, please talk to your agent, please call somebody who knows, because that misinformation can stop somebody from putting a claim in for their horse if they have insurance. It can negatively affect whether or not they have insurance, and for the wrong reasons, really the wrong reasons, versus sort of having a full understanding of what equine insurance is, and then sort of making a decision thereafter if you want to have it or not. And so that's the wonderful thing about equine insurance, is that it is a choice. And I always like to tell people that, because so often we're pushed into insurance for our cars, our homes, and we don't have a choice. Most of the time with equine insurance, we have a choice. And that's a wonderful thing, regardless of what you have. So I guess I like to start with the basics. And what is equine insurance? What are we actually insuring? And we start with mortality insurance, which, for lack of a better way to describe it, is replacement cost for your horse, which is really awful to sounding, but it's meant to allow you to go out and buy another horse of equal age, breed, and ability, if something happens, your horse were to die. So the building block, that's the very basis of the insurance, is mortality. And that's based off of your horse's initial purchase price, and then things like training that you've done, you've paid for, and show record. You can increase horses' values as you put money into them within reason, and that's sort of a whole subtopic into itself. But mortality is where you start. And then you build on top of that. You can add things like major medical and surgical insurance, which is highly desirable, because hopefully our horses don't die. We want to keep that from happening. And so we're hoping to be able to pay the medical expenses that we need to treat our horses. So that one is very, very commonly asked. And unfortunately, we can't do just major medical. We have to do some sort of mortality, and then we add medical on top of that, which usually includes surgical. So that's sort of your initial building block of how and what it is. And there's also liability insurance. That's sort of a subset into itself for people who not only own just privately owned horses, as well as instructors and trainers, farms. And so that's another component that sort of gets missed a lot too, is that aside from your horse physically in the injuries or the death that could come on from something like an accident, an injury, or illness, but also the liability side of things, which is that if your horse gets loose or onto the road or bites somebody or hurts somebody and you get sued, there's also policies that exist out there for both the private horse owner as well as the instructor trainer, the commercial horse owner. So it's really cool that there's different things out there to sort of protect you on both sides of things, because sometimes the liability could be much more devastating financially, even more than losing a horse and having to pay medical expenses. So there's a lot there. And so a lot of times I sort of put my feelers out for what people are really looking as far as information goes. And I don't know if it makes sense to sort of see if there's any questions and sort of drive it from there, or I can kind of continue on with what sort of the missed things about equine insurance that people don't know about. Kind of depends on what you guys want to do.
I think go ahead and do those. I have a bunch of questions that we had submitted before this even started, but I think you might answer a lot of them. So I think go ahead and dive in, and then I'll check off ones I feel like you answered.
All right, that sounds good. So I bring this up, and it's really morbid, but it's very, very, very important with mortality insurance. To have an insurance company pay out on your horse's mortality, typically they require a necropsy be done. I bring this up in the very beginning of conversations with people because the idea of a necropsy or an autopsy or a postmortem, all the same sort of thing, done to your horse is a very jarring sort of thought, especially because they're very big animals. And so there's a lot of question marks as to how, you go about doing that. And does the insurance cover that? And why do we have to do that? And to answer those questions, it's because the insurance company requires some sort of absolute cause of death. And so the necropsies that are required can vary in degrees as to whether or not they are just photo documentation, if it's a catastrophic event, broken limb or something like that, versus something more comprehensive with something that's internal, even things that aren't necessarily looked at as being internal, but colic being the big one, where even if a vet's like, this horse is colicking, you still would need to do some sort of necropsy before you bury to make certain that you're going to be able to get the payout through the insurance. And it's not talked about, and it's written on everything that is sent out, but it's the worst case scenario in my mind, that if you're in a situation where your horse is so ill or in such a bad place that you're thinking of euthanasia, or you even find a horse dead and then you find out that you have to do a necropsy, that's a lot. That's a bad day, and that's a lot of things to have to consider. And because they're such big animals, and because some people's belief sets or religious affiliations, things like that, sometimes keep them from wanting to do a necropsy, if you know about it going into the gate, then at least you can decide if it's going to null the whole point of having insurance for you, because perhaps you wouldn't do one at all. And also just gives you an idea of what kind of game plan perhaps that you should have if your horse were to die. Just like people, it's morbid, but it's a good idea to have a game plan as to what you would do if your horse was vitally ill and you had to make an awful choice that day and put your horse down. So I bring that up. And also, it's not covered by your insurance. So it is actually a cost that you have to pay out of pocket. It is anything that comes after a horse, pretty much euthanasia and after, is not covered by the insurance. And that's another thing. It's the euthanasia, the actual cost for that, as well as aftercare and necropsy. So your burials, anything to that extent afterwards that you need to pay for, whether that's transporting a body, that sort of stuff is not covered by the insurance. However, when they pay out on the mortality, that check that you receive for your horse's value, that's your money. So they don't dictate what you do with it. They're hoping you're going to buy another horse, but maybe you use some of it to offset costs that weren't covered by insurance. So I bring that up right in the beginning because, like I said, it's really morbid and I hate talking about it because we're talking about horses dying, but really, really important. Big deal, I think. It really isn't always a big deal when it happens as far as the actual necropsy itself, but just knowing you need to do one is a big deal. So that's one thing I like to bring up. The other thing is claims. So if you have a policy in place, people ask me all the time, when do I call in a claim? And how does it affect my policy? And how do we go moving forward from there? And the insurance company's rule of thumb is that if you have your vet out for anything that is not routine care, so an accident, an injury, or an illness, you should start a claim. And this is really easy when you have a major situation. Of course, you think, I got to call in a claim. But something like maybe an abscess where it's not a big deal, and perhaps you treat it initially, and then you have your vet maybe do some x-rays because you're just concerned it's not, you're not making the progress you should. And it doesn't seem like a big deal at all. It can explode into a big deal. And so the insurance companies like prompt notification of claims. So that way you have coverage, because sometimes depending on the company and how long it took for you to start the claim, they can deny it because it's taken you more than 30 or more than 60 days to report it. So it's really counterintuitive because, again, with regular lines of insurance, like your home and your auto, it's sort of depending upon the situation, but sometimes it's your own prerogative to decide if you're going to put a claim in. And it truly is, of course, with equine too, but you just don't want to have a situation where you could have had some money paid out, or a major situation that gets denied because you didn't start the claim early. And a lot of people call me first if it's not a life-threatening situation because they don't know what they should do. And that's a really good idea, is to call your agent and say, my horse is lame, the vet's coming out, what do I do? Do I start a claim now? Do I wait? How does it get covered? And I sort of help guide them, usually with starting a claim and just getting them talking directly to an adjuster, and then going from there. And that's usually what happens, is people deal directly with the insurance company's adjusters, and then they kind of just go off on their own. Because unfortunately, I don't have a lot of pull with claims, but I can help guide you in the beginning, get you where you need to be, so that way you just submit your invoices and things like that to be reimbursed for your claim. So I bring that up because I have every year people send their paperwork into me for renewal, and it says, I know, treated my horse for ulcers, something like that. And they didn't put a claim in for it. And that's okay, except for the insurance companies will often place exclusions on pre-existing conditions. So in the scenario of somebody sending a application that says, I had my horse treated for ulcers, the insurance company is actually going to place an exclusion on their renewal for ulcers, regardless of the fact that they paid out a claim or not. So it is only really in your benefit to put the claim in, because if you get anything back, it's better than nothing. And these exclusion wordings can happen, like I said, regardless. So that's sort of why we push people to usually start the claim, because if you can get anything back, it's just, and it's sort of a backwards logic thing. We wish they did it differently, but everybody does it the same way. All the insurance companies out there, that's how they operate. And it's equine insurance. It has to be different. It can't be the same as, regular lines of insurance. We have to just be a little bit off kilter a bit.
Jade, that does answer one of the questions I had, which I think you pretty much answered, was how do I know what to tell my insurance agent? Would you encourage people to report most things? How do you advise people?
Well, of course, we always want people to be upfront and honest about everything. We don't want anybody lying on their application, but there is sort of it's hard because I'm a horse person first and I'm an insurance agent second. And I tell people that all the time. And I'm sure that I'm not sure the insurance companies I work with would like that sentiment, but ultimately we do have to decide, if we know that we're going to have potential exclusion wording, how does that impact what we put on our application, how much information we divulge when we start a claim. And it is a very tricky thing to answer. And it's mostly because every situation is so different from the next, even if it's the same problem, with, maybe ulcers. Like I said, I bring that one up a lot because ulcers are a very common claim. And so it just really depends upon what's going on with your policy, what you already have for exclusions, if any, and knowing that you're going to have an exclusion either way. Sometimes if it's really something really small, like I go back to having an abscess, for example. If you have a vet out for an abscess, and it really is truly just an abscess, and you pack and you soak and you do those things, but you have your vet out because you want to be overly cautious, and that's great. And that it resolves in a couple of weeks and your horse is back to good, and it was truly just that. Well, do you put a claim in for that? Because its chances are really good that it's not going to exceed your deductible. And are you going to waste your time having to do the paperwork? Well, that's really hard, right? Because No, I mean, yeah. And what sort of exclusionary wording do they place on that? Well, I'll tell you, 5 years ago, they probably wouldn't have placed any, but now they probably would place an exclusion for abscess left front, or something like that, which wouldn't probably last very long. They would probably stay on the policy for a year, and then we could request that it be removed. But yeah, that's why it's really good to talk to your agent, because sometimes I'll tell people, and very seldom, but sometimes I'll say, let's wait, see what your vet says, see what the outcome is, and then go from there. And then upon renewal, when you're completing paperwork, which looks just like the paperwork that you filled out initially, because it pretty much is, because every year you have to redo things, it's going to ask that question: have you had the vet out for anything other than routine care? And realistically, you should put yes and disclose that the horse was seen for an abscess, and then they'll ask for paperwork from your veterinarian that gives the definitive diagnosis, and it, depending on the company, may or may not yield an exclusion. But at the same time, sometimes I think the problem is that if we don't disclose information and run the risk of having an exclusion, and you have a future issue and it's related to that issue that you had initially, the insurance companies can decline that claim, because perhaps, for example, say your horse has a bout of colic and it's medical in nature, and the vet comes to the farm and it's resolved on farm. It doesn't require going to the veterinary clinic, so it's not very expensive. Actually, those sort of colics are so inexpensive, relatively speaking. And your policy expires, you renew it, and you say nothing about that colic on the application. And say a month down the road, your horse colics again. In some scenarios, when they send in the paperwork to your veterinarian, which is what they do when you start a claim, the veterinarian could say, attended horse at the barn 3 months ago for colic. And what happens is the insurance company goes, well, you didn't tell us about that, for starters. And now we know that this horse had a previous colic. We're not going to cover it because we're considering it pre-existing. And so in some situations, if you had disclosed it, they may or may not place an exclusion on the policy, but at least and you're not surprised. So it's sort of like the devil is
Right.
better than the devil you don't. And that's why transparency is usually the best way to go, which makes sense, because I feel like that's pretty much the case in most situations. But it is really hard. It is really hard because sometimes it just doesn't make sense. But again, equine insurance doesn't always have to make sense. Just have to know what you're supposed to do. So that hopefully answers your question without too much ambiguity.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I think on the you spoke a little bit about mortality, so I think this one fits in here. I have two really that do. Do most insurance agencies require that you let them know before you euthanize your horse, or if you tell them after, or maybe you don't euthanize your horse in the rare case that they do pass away on their own? How does that work?
That's a great question. And the rule of thumb, if you're able, is to get the insurance company involved before you euthanize. And it's not because there's sort of a myth that says that the insurance company has to tell you you're allowed to put your horse to sleep. And it's certainly not the case, because it's your horse and you do what is best for your horse first and foremost. And I always tell people, regardless of the insurance, take care of your horse and what you need and what your horse needs. But if you're able to get started with that claim and you're able to talk to a claims adjuster, or if it's a really bad situation and you can get your veterinarian to talk to the claims adjuster, they can provide clarification as to what is necessary to make sure that that claim gets pushed through correctly. We never want somebody to euthanize and bury and then find out they have to do a necropsy, because that's just not okay. And we've had a few of those happen over the years, and it's awful because we want the mortality to pay out for that person. So definitely getting the insurance company involved as soon as possible is a great idea. And like I said, veterinarians will often step up if it's a bad day and perhaps the insured is very emotional. And sometimes they'll talk to the insurance company and say, what do we need to do? And that sort of ties into that whole necropsy concept, where they might say, okay, say it's a traumatic injury. Like I said, it's very clear that things are not going to be fixed. A limb that's not maybe facing the direction it should. In those situations, it's often just photographs that need to be documented, sometimes x-rays if it's not really obvious, and that's sufficient for necropsy, but that needs to be done before the horse goes into the ground, or of course if the horse is going to be cremated. So if that's not done beforehand, all this ambiguity happens, and then sometimes things don't get done correctly. Now, if you have a horse that passes away on its own and you find it, well, then you call the insurance company as soon as you can. Same idea. And that way they relay to you what you need to do and give you the clarification so that you do follow the steps properly. But never is it that the insurance company is giving you authorization. It's rather sometimes making sure that everybody's on the same page and that you're going to receive your mortality payout. Very, very infrequently, but does happen. You can have situations where the insurance company disagrees. If you have a veterinarian, though, that is saying that this horse needs to be euthanized, you know, that it is inhumane for otherwise, or it is the viable option to choose, you know, sometimes surgical situations are on the table, but maybe not the best choice for a horse, then they're most likely going to agree with the veterinarian. It's only when you have sort of a situation that is a bit more vague, injuries that aren't necessarily life-threatening on the table, or not on the surface rather, that's where sometimes there needs to be a bit more conversation had before euthanasia. But those are usually situations that can avail a little more time, right? We don't want our horses to suffer, so we don't want that ever. But some situations there can be a little bit of wiggle room with weight, you know, and making sure everything is done correctly and everybody's on the same page. So always kind of back to that whole insurance claim concept where it applies, I think, ever the more importantly to those life-threatening situations, and especially when there's, you know, a horse that's going to be put to sleep for certain.
I guess right on the same topic, one of the questions was, can a necropsy, does it have to be performed at a clinic or a hospital, or does what your vet is capable of doing on the farm, is that good enough?
It depends on the situation. We don't see a lot of on-farm necropsies done when they're involved. But like I said, if it's something that's more apparent and a veterinarian feels comfortable that they can confirm what has happened and they're comfortable with doing that necropsy on farm, then that's not an issue with the insurance company. They'll send a form to the veterinarian for a postmortem to be completed. And certainly they're not going to send it, you know, if it's needs to be done right away, they're not going to send that paperwork in time for that vet to complete it. But if the veterinarians usually know, and it's up to the veterinarian to make the decision as to what they feel like they need to do to be able to arrive to that cause of death. Like I said before, some of those really heinous injuries that are catastrophic on site, they can do on-site necropsies because it really doesn't require very much. But colic situations and neurologic situations, those are more commonly than any. I haven't really seen in the last 20 years having anybody, I don't think I've heard of anybody doing it on site for like a neurologic or a colic situation. I think they've always brought the horse to the clinic. In some grizzly situations, I know they have like removed body parts to send for necropsies if it's something specific to that limb. And I think that's been fine, but I can't speak completely because I don't make the rules for that. As long as the veterinarian feels comfortable with what the outcome is, usually the insurance company is okay with it too, but they have to call it a postmortem or necropsy. It's funny, the language that has to be utilized to make sure that it's what the insurance company wants. If a vet comes out and it's, say, a colic situation, I had a very good friend's horse actually at the barn next door to me have an acute colic that was very, very nasty, and he was in a lot of pain, and there was absolutely no chance this horse was going to go to clinic. It would have been inhumane. We put him to sleep on the trailer because we knew we were going to have to haul him. We just knew that it was going to be the better situation than having to hire a truck and that sort of thing. And that worked for us. And it ultimately, you know, we got the necropsy done and everything was paid out, and that my friend had the ability to go out and buy another horse. So it's an awful thing, but it's definitely, I think it's because they're so big, right? You know, if our dogs and our cats, it wouldn't seem so challenging to do something like that. But with these big animals, especially our Frisians, it's like, oh, that's a lot of mass to move.
Absolutely. And this, I guess we're kind of on the morbid mortality track here. So I'm giving you those questions as we go. And you did mention this a little bit about how the calculating the value of your horse is made. Is that something that can ever be adjusted after the horse has died, or everyone needs to be on the same page versus, oh, I forgot to tell you about all these awards he won last month, or, you know, the trainer I sent him to?
Yeah, so it's also another really good question. So the very beginning of the policy, everything is established as far as value at that point. So we write these policies on what they call an agreed value. And it is that the insurance company at the beginning agrees to the value that you're requesting. So, for example, say you bought a horse as a yearling and you put a lot of money into them, and now you want to insure, you've done very well at showing, you want to insure for $50,000, which is more than you paid for, definitely. And you sent in the application to us and justification of value, which is pretty much just a rundown of what you put into the horse for, for training, what you've maybe paid, which is an awful thing to tally up. It's like, don't
You don't
look at
want to
those
know.
numbers. Don't look at those numbers. But more importantly, the show record, once you provide those sort of things, we submit that in with the application to the insurance company, and they come back and say, we agree to that value. Or perhaps in some scenarios, they'll say, well, we need a little bit more, or this is the value we agree upon. I go back to the insured. We make sure that everybody's happy with the value that the policy has on it. Then you move forward with the policy being issued. So then when a horse dies, then you have that agreed value, and it's not subject to the marketplace, which is so volatile, and either it will work for you or against you, and that would just add an additional layer of complexity onto a situation that's already very complex. So that's how it all runs. And sometimes, depending upon the company, when you do submit the paperwork after your horse has died, sometimes they'll ask for a reiteration of what you've done for justification of value, for training and show records. But since you had to give it to us initially when we started the whole policy, then a lot of times we have that on file and we just submit it in, or you just take a copy of it and submit it in with the loss paperwork that you need to submit when a horse dies. So it doesn't add a lot of additional complexities. That being said, it is way more common and more accepted by the insurance companies to start a policy at a certain value and stay there, and then upon renewal readjust and reevaluate your horse's value. But if you have a horse that goes to nationals and wins midway through the policy period, most cases the insurance company will let you adjust as long as that horse is healthy and sound, which if it just won is most likely the case. They'll let you adjust a horse's value if you feel like now you're under insured. We don't see that as often, but certainly, in situations there are some where you're like, my horse just won everything and I never expected, or I did expect it, and now somebody offered me $100,000 and I'm insuring at 50 and I feel very exposed. Then we can always look to do that midway through. But the absolute rule of thumb is that we cannot adjust a policy at all if a horse is not healthy and sound. So if there's any claim going on, we can't adjust anything, unfortunately.
Are appraisers used, or is it based off of what you said in terms of what you've paid and what you put into the horse, or can an outside person appraise the value of the horse for the policy?
So appraisals don't have any validity in equine insurance. I think it's because they feel that it's not very well regulated. That being said, I'm not sure how justification of value forms are all the more regulated than that, because it's sort of taking on faith that someone is telling the truth. But that's sort of the hallmark of the policy, and I mean the application in itself, is you're hoping people are being honest. So appraisals don't go very far. That being said, if somebody did an appraisal and you include it, it's not going to hurt. Sometimes it's helpful to have some, like, your trainer or somebody write up something as to sort of benefit the request to increase a horse's value. But really, at the end of the day, the insurance company wants to know if you've been paying for training and what your show record is. And those speak volumes well above anything else that we submit. If it's a breeding situation, sometimes siblings, full siblings, half siblings values can help, but that's often more something that affects when we're trying to insure younger horses, of course, or a new foal, when you're trying to figure out value. And that's a tricky sort of thing too, because how do we establish value for horses that are just born? And generally it's 3 times the stud fee, which is, I think, a little low right now, but nobody's really budging on that at the moment, unless there's proof that full siblings or sometimes half siblings have been sold at a very young age for a whole lot more, or in utero. So that's sort of another kind of area in itself, but that affects mostly just young horses, foals mostly.
Well, I think that leads me into the next kind of area of questions that we had, and those I'll give you a couple of them, and that was when do I insure my foal? can I insure a pregnancy and can I insure an embryo?
Okay. So with a new foal, we can start mortality insurance at 24 hours old. It requires a vet form, and we cannot bind coverages without the vet form and the application completed and in hand. And just like a normal, just like an older horse, we can't start insurance if a horse is not healthy and sound. So you have to have that foal at 24 hours be, healthy. There could be some things that are small, but anything that's major, they won't insure. They won't let you start it. At 31 days of age, we can then add onto that policy, which is at that point is only mortality. At 31 days, we can add medical and surgical coverages onto the policy. An important caveat is that typically congenital defects and things like that are not covered by the insurance. And so sometimes that will really only affect new foals. So if you have a horse that's born with a defect and that defect causes a claim, there's not likely to be coverage. Because that's something that's excluded on it to begin with. But if you have a situation like an injury that happens or a pneumonia or something like that to a very young foal, then you'd find as long as you're over 31 days of age and you've added the medical on, that there'd be medical coverages available. And if it were before that and the foal were to die, you would have reimbursement for mortality. So that's the hallmark. That's the ages that you can start with a foal. You can With embryos, there are what we call prospective foal coverage. A lot of insurance companies will not write this anymore. There are still some that will, and that is designed to reimburse you for your expenses for that foal that perhaps doesn't come to term. And it's relatively expensive when you compare it to regular mortality for a foal that's been born, but it is available in some situations. It's just sometimes I think the cost of benefit isn't always there. And then I think I've forgotten the other question you asked me, so it had to do with all this.
Whoa, I think you got them. When can I insure my foal? Oh, can you insure a pregnancy, or does the value of while the mare is carrying the foal, can her value increase? How would that work?
So you can insure generally you can insure a pregnant mare or a mare you're going to breed. There are some limitations depending on the company. Some companies won't take maiden mares that are over, a certain age. Some insurance companies won't write if a mare has, a track record of perhaps having difficulties with, being bred and whatnot. But generally speaking, we can certainly do it. And it doesn't often cost very much more, if at all, more depending on the company to have breeding added. And it's all you do is instead of having your hunter jumper or your dressage horse, you have your hunter jumper dressage horse breeding. It's just another discipline that we just assign to the policy, and that gives us a rate, and that's how we come up with the premium. But it's not usually very much more expensive, if any more expensive at all, than other types of disciplines or usages. Now, depending on the company, some companies will let you increase that mare's value while she's carrying, which is sort of like a workaround in a bit to that prospective foal coverage, but it only would pay out if that mare were to die, of course. So if you had a really bad situation and that mare died, carrying that foal, then you would find that you could insure, you'd be getting more money back than if it was just the mare alone. So some companies will let you do that, certainly. Some companies will take that into consideration when you're actually starting the policy, sort of that agreed value concept. But it really depends. And it depends upon what you've paid for the stud fee and all that fun stuff. But the long answer short is that yes, you certainly can. You can do all three of those things.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So I guess to jump to something Frisian specific. So we are the Fauna Health Committee, right? And we focus on health of Frisians. And Frisians can have some health challenges that other breeds don't have. Are Frisians more expensive to insure than any other horses? And then I think this person's second part of the question were, have you any claims with horses, Frisians with megaesophagus? Are you familiar with that? Can they be insured? So all Frisian specific.
Yeah, so it's funny because it depends on the company. We have a few companies that within the last 4 or 5 years have started to be more picky with what and when we can insure Frisians. So we usually have a generalized rate sheet that we go off of when we're doing quotes. And that's the case with some of the companies we have, and they're not always breed specific. So they don't look at Friesians any differently than they'd look at any other breed of horse. But a couple of the companies we have started to really, they want to see the risk first. They want to see if that horse has any pre-existing issues. And sometimes they're less lenient with Friesians than some other breeds. Now, that being said, it's not just Friesians that are sort of having this limitations. Thoroughbreds sort of get put into this pool, and some other breeds. And I'm not entirely sure why, to be honest, because we see a lot of claims. There's a ton of claims on a daily basis that come in for equine insurance. So I don't recognize from an agent standpoint a huge influx in our Friesians, whether that's a medical issue or a mortality claim. I really haven't seen a big difference there, but I'm also not the insurance company, so I don't know what they're seeing in a whole. And I don't really know why, because I don't know if it's because inherently we find that our Friesians are so very stoic, and so things aren't always noticed until they're really bad, where maybe you would have caught it with a different breed of horse sooner because they would have shown you something's wrong. I haven't seen any claims for esophagus. There we go. I think it depends in that scenario with that sort of claim being paid out would be depending upon when it started. And also if I'm not sure if actually we'd have any issues getting policy started. It very well could cause a horse to be uninsurable. It depends on the insurance company, and ultimately we submit everything to our underwriters. And in all transparency, there's no rule of thumb. Things change and our underwriters change, and so the policy wording stays the same, but the policy wording is never breed specific. So it doesn't say in there, will not take Friesians that have this problem, this problem, this problem. And if any of that happens, we're not going to insure them. There's nothing like that. So whenever I talk to somebody and they're not certain if their horse has an issue, whether it's a Friesian or otherwise, and if it's going to impact them getting insurance, we always say, let's submit it to our underwriters. And the nice thing is generally brokers have, Foy Insurance is a broker. So generally we have access to many different insurance companies, which is a really good thing, because one insurance company may say no, another company may say that's not a problem. And that's what we see a lot of, unless there's something really major. If a horse has a chronic illness that is, very significant, then perhaps you can't insure. But really, I tried to ask the question not long ago to my underwriters, why are we having to put these limitations? It's not just Friesians, it's Lusitanos. It's sort of our Baroque style horses that they've been placing these. And I haven't seen huge loss differences. So I don't know. And sometimes it does yield a higher rate for those breeds of horses to insure. So and that's subject to change. So who knows? Because that's something that's recent and within the last 5 years, recent.
Sure. I guess this is a personal question, not one that someone sent in. When we got to chat with you a couple minutes before we started, you mentioned that the insurance world has changed a little bit since COVID, or like you just mentioned in the last 5 years. Maybe I can ask that personal question. What have you seen and why?
Well, so we saw with COVID a huge boost in people purchasing horses, and prices skyrocket. And I would never have guessed that. I mean, not that anybody guessed there'd be a pandemic either, but the result of that being that horses' prices were astronomically higher. You couldn't buy horses under a certain value, and it was just crazy. And that has started to come down a little bit, but it's still affecting things. So what happened is we ended up having a ton of business flood in. And insurance companies get a ton of business, which is great, also a ton of claims. And so we're starting to see companies placing more limitations into their policy wordings. Ulcers, I bring ulcers back into play. 5 years ago, ulcers, and some companies had some limitations for ulcers, but now everybody does. There's no situation where a company pays a full ulcer claim. They'll pay up to a certain amount, or for a certain amount of treatments, all requiring, scoping. Some companies make you wait a certain period of time for ulcers. And that's a new thing. And that's simply because they had so much business come in, which is a good thing, but so many claims that they sort of started to rein in. And we talked a little bit before about exclusions, which is a really bad word in health insurance in general. People go excluded, but that's the driving force in equine insurance. You don't see increases in cost necessarily because of claims or past medical issues. You see exclusion wording. And it used to be that exclusions would be placed on things that happened, not on things that could happen. we're starting to see now exclusion wording, regardless of breed and usage. We see wording that's being placed sort of more broadly, and sometimes they place an exclusion that could be because of something else. So, for example, if a horse foundered or even had an acute laminitic situation, sometimes, and it depends on the company and the situation, they'll place an exclusion for founder, as well as, like, metabolic disorders and things that sort of all kind of encompassed into that founder. Unless it's apparent what that was, the cause was, which sometimes you just never know. They starting to cover all of their bases, which is frustrating. And it's not to dissuade people from the insurance. It's just transparency and knowing that these things happen to everybody. And that's something that we've seen worsen since COVID. And like I said, I think it's because so many people bought horses. And I don't know if it's because just the cost also, oh, the other thing, the cost of medical care is only gone up. Everything has gone up, right? Everything costs more. Equine veterinary care is certainly right there with everything else. And also there's a lot of new types of treatments that are expensive. And so these insurance companies are starting to really mitigate some of their claims by placing more broad exclusions or placing some limitations within their policies. And the policies are best designed for your catastrophic situations. They still have a lot of value for things that aren't catastrophic in nature. But it's some days are a little harder than others in sort of understanding where the insurance companies are coming from. I'm an agent. I understand most of the time. Since COVID, sometimes I don't always understand or agree. And that's a really tough thing. But like I said, we're not, it's everybody. I mean, if I have a horse, I insure her. I would not be excluded from the same issues as the regular, anybody else that came in. So it's COVID has made things tricky for sure.
Interesting.
Mm.
Guess we'll jump a little bit. Who should insure their horse? Very, very broad question, but
Buddy,
who needs insurance?
well, it's fun because there's a lot of misinformation that really you should only insure your horse if you have a highfalutin show horse. You spent a lot of money. Not for nothing, a lot of money is very subjective. Some people consider, it depends, right? What your income is, what you have, and what you're willing to spend. And so the short answer is you can insure a horse that you've rescued. Value is not always a deterrent on getting in coverages. Now, most companies won't insure horses under a certain value, but we have companies that will. And it's cool because if you did just go rescue a horse, you could most likely insure that horse, provided that horse is also not a bag of, accident, injury, and problems. If you get a horse that is broken, then you can't insure it right away. And I mean broken meaning that we have an accident, an injury, or illness that happened recently and they're still not sound or healthy. You can't insure a horse that is not healthy and sound. So that's one horse that you cannot. But ultimately, you can insure a horse that is 24 hours old up to 20 years old. 21 is usually the cutoff. So
that was another question. So yep, go ahead.
The older horses, which is a real bummer because 21 is just not that old, depending on the horse, for certain. But it's just the 21 is usually it. Some companies, if you've been insuring your horse with that company for a while and the horse has been healthy, sometimes they'll let you insure for 21, sometimes 22 is very rare, but they increase the cost to insure your horse at usually age 16, depends on the insurance company, could be age 15, and sometimes it's a little higher. So they do this thing where they're like, well, you can insure your older horse, older being, like I said, 16 plus, I guess we'll use that as a general older term, but it's going to cost you more. So you're like, all right, which isn't really fair because I think age is not always indicative of a horse's health. But again, I'm the agent, so I supply my own knowledge into things and it's not all that vast. So yeah, so don't think that you can't insure your backyard horse because you can't. And we have a policy right now that you can do bottom barrel limits of $5,000 medical policy for a horse that you can insure for next to nothing. And you can pay like $300 a year for $5,000 worth of coverage, which, in a situation like a colic or a major situation, like major medical situation, then that's great. That's That's not bad. And
Yeah.
it can go up from there, of course. The higher values you purchase, the more it costs, the older your horse, oh, yada, yada. So,
Great. Um, can you insure a horse for travel or for a show? That I guess that they're doing something risky. Would you let the insurance company know, or can you not do that?
what's cool is when you insure your horse, it follows the horse, the insurance. So whether you are going to shows or you are just going trail riding someplace else or whatever it may be, as long as you're in the continental United States or Canada, your policy will follow you. That being said, if you have a horse that you are importing or exporting to then re-import, depending on the situation, you can add additional coverages which will extend your domestic policy abroad. So if somebody is buying a horse from the Netherlands, from Germany, or wherever it may be, we can start that policy before they're in the United States. Costs a little bit more, but it's really not a whole lot more money to add what they call international transit. The only time we need to add transit to a policy is if they're coming from another country, except for Canada, because we're attached. That's okay. So it's yeah, it's really nice. And it would be very maddening, I think, for everybody involved if I had to be told every time a horse moved to a different boarding facility or was going to a horse show. So that's a really good thing.
You just have to say on the horse's use that he's a show horse, and then any show is covered. If you say he's a
Right.
trail horse and you're at the Olympics, you might be concerned, but
Yeah, it's like one of the sort of the biggest upheaval lately in equine insurance has got to do with eventing horses. We don't have a lot of eventing Friesians. That every once in a while we see one come through, but it's definitely more of a sport breed, not a, anyways, I get a little bit sometimes down these rabbit holes, but we're having issues placing eventing horses, coverage for eventing horses. A lot of companies, big companies, have dropped eventing horses. So this doesn't impact, again, the Frisian community quite so much, but it's another thing that has happened where that is important to know. So if somebody puts that they're doing hunter jumpers and then they're eventing and their horse gets injured going over, at an eventing competition, that could jeopardize coverage. And that being said, too, we tell people when they start the policy, you put down your usage or your discipline at the beginning, and that doesn't mean that you can't change. It's just usually important that you let us know, and that's really big changes if you're going from being a dressage horse to a jumper. Then that's the risk situation is different, and so the cost of the insurance or the rates that we use, they can differ depending on the company. So it can cost you more money to insure a jumper than it costs you to do a dressage horse, which actually makes sense. And it costs the most to be an eventer because, that's generally the most risky. Or at least the insurance company thinks so.
sure, makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, says if I buy a new horse, can I get a policy to be in place? I guess they're asking at the exact time. So I bought this horse at noon and I'm picking it up and one person owned it and now I own it. How does that transition work?
So typically we can get coverages started right away. So we're usually able to do that. Some insurance companies, they require either a vet form to be completed or a copy of the pre-purchase if one was done. But we have companies that don't require that. So depending on the horse's value and what company is ideal for them to be insured with, we can usually get coverages started right away. Like I said, some companies, our lower valued horses are impacted more by that requirement of having to have either a copy of the pre-purchase exam or a vet form done if a pre-purchase was not done. That being said, that company that I'm referring to, they actually are okay with not receiving a vet form if a horse hasn't had a pre-purchase exam, if you had that horse or known that horse for more than 30 days. So that sometimes people know the horse they're purchasing. Perhaps they've been trialing it for a bit, or perhaps they leased it beforehand. And perhaps that's why they didn't do a vetting, because they don't need to. I purchased a horse in barn without one because I knew the horse really well. And in that case, I didn't need to provide anything veterinary and otherwise to be able to get the insurances started. I just needed to complete an application. But I guess the hallmark of all of this is that every situation is different from the next. So it's always a good idea if you're able to talk to the agent before you're finalizing purchase so that you can get all your ducks in a row. But I know sometimes things move quickly, especially during COVID, everything moved very quickly. You had to get there and buy a horse and sight unseen right then and there. Otherwise you'd lose the opportunity. That's still true in some cases. So if you're not able to talk to your agent beforehand, it's a bummer. But if you can, then we'll usually set you up for success and make sure that you know what we need so that we can get it in place. Certainly, because we want you to have insurance as soon as you actually own that horse, but definitely before the horse gets on a trailer, because that's always the scary moment, right? Where
Right.
very exposed with a horse you don't know putting on a trailer, and especially if you're hauling a long distance. So you want to have that insurance in place, and generally we can do that.
Perfect.
Mm.
You're doing just perfectly on timing. We're getting 10 minutes to our hour, and I have one question left, and that is, as a broker, what's your opinion on some of the policies covered by, for example, Smart Pack, or there seem to be more companies out there that are doing colic surgery or other things if you feed their food? Is that as good as having your horse insured, or what's your opinion on something like that?
I always think that whatever you can do to sort of help your horse be healthy, regardless of sort of what you might get out of it, is a good thing. So I don't really dissuade people from getting any additional coverages. Some companies, most companies are okay with that, and they're okay with you just having more coverages outside of your insurance. Some consider that to be primary, some consider it to be secondary. So that meaning, of course, that maybe your insurance policy will pay out, and then you'd go to that other coverage. Sometimes it's the other way around. There's a few companies that get a little funny with it if they know a horse has something like a Smart Pack, colic care. But in my mind, I don't think that it is ever a bad thing to have extra coverage, especially for things like colic. So I don't have a strong opinion on those sort of things. I don't utilize anything like that specifically for my horse, but sometimes it's a really good option for people who can't insure their horses either. You know, perhaps their horse has had some past issues, but you're able to get colic care or something like that where you otherwise wouldn't be able to for insurance. And that's not a bad thing at all. But there are all sorts of things that come up that I'll hear about from someone and I have to look them up because I don't even realize it. This, like, everything's always changing, which is really good for my brain because I have to keep learning things. But also sometimes I feel a little dumbfounded because I don't know about something until somebody tells me about it, and then I have to go look it up, make sure I can talk about it intelligently. And even still, like I said, it depends on the company as to what they and how they feel about it. But I'd say it's a choice, and having options is always a good thing.
Sure. But you haven't seen a conflict where they, like, for example, an insurance company says, oh, I don't want to pay for your colic surgery because you have colic care. You talked about primary and secondary.
We haven't seen that, and I think sometimes it's because the two don't generally get a chance to talk. You know,
Yeah.
they don't know they exist. The rule of thumb, though, is that you can't, for traditional lines of insurance, you're not, traditional types of equine insurance, so you're usually not allowed to have duplicate coverage. So I think that's where there's a little bit of a gray area there is it considered duplicate coverage or is it not? And
Right.
it's not really fair to say that you can't do something, especially if a requirement of that is that you decided you're gonna feed out a certain supplement that is hopefully going to keep your horse from colicking at all. That's a good thing. The insurance company should be on board with that because you're trying to prohibit that from happening, which would of course be a claim that they'd have to pay out. So I think there's a little bit of a blind eye there. And like I said, I don't think the two ever get a chance to really talk too much. So that's not a bad thing. But I'm certainly not as well educated on that, all the nuances that come within that scope, as I am other things. So I may not have all the correct information there. I'm gonna have
There
to ask
seem
this
to be
question.
new ones all the time. Like, I think Smart Pack's the most known, but you'll see if you feed this, and yeah.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, things are always changing.
Jade, that is all of our questions, and we're right at an hour. Is there anything else you wish people knew about horse insurance? Or I think you've I've jumped around a little bit, but you covered so many different things.
Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of stuff. Always just ask questions. That's my advice. Always is ask questions, read your policy, understand what you're purchasing, because really at the end of the day, it's all you can do from, yeah, just wanting to make sure that you understand everything because you want to go into a claim knowing what to expect to a certain degree so that everybody's happy. And that's really that's sort of my parting gift is read your policy and ask questions. I will never have a problem with people asking me questions. Ask them the same question 3 times. I don't care. If I can relay the information to you and you understand it, that's a win because I want everybody to be informed and make sure that there's no gray areas that you might be confused or upset about in the future, especially when it comes to some of these policies that can be a little bit hard to understand. Those are the liability policies, I think, are probably the most difficult to get through, but the actual mortality and medical policies, I think, are pretty, relatively speaking, pretty easy to understand and digest. So read those policies, people. Read them. Know what you're getting.
We don't
Always.
read those.
Yeah. Please read your policy and definitely read and ask questions from your agent, because that's why we're here. So
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jade. I think this was wonderful. We really appreciate you taking the time to answer all these questions for us. This was recorded tonight, so it will be up in the Fauna library. So people that weren't able to attend it live can go back and watch it. So if you go to fauna.com and you look under the webinars tab, right on the home page in a few days, probably beginning of next week, this video will be available. If you have any questions for Jade and want to send it to fauna@fauna.com, we'd be happy to pass along if someone wasn't able to watch it live. I think we got in all the questions, but if we missed one, you can let me know. So I'd like to thank everyone so much for joining us, and the Health Committee has more topics coming up in the future, and we're so glad you could be here, and everyone just have a great night.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jade. Very, very interesting lecture on insurance. I learned a lot. I was not very well informed. And I'm
good.
going to be sending you a couple of questions I have in mind.
Excellent. I'll be here.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Good night.
Good night.